welcome to the oldest bookstore in Los Angeles. We're 81 years old, and we continue to stay in business because people will buy books. We hope one, for example, by Jennifer Rubin, who happens to be our guest tonight. I've been particularly excited about this evening because it is an opportunity to speak with two really consequential journalists. Warren Olney is a Los Angeles treasure. I'm positive every person who is participating tonight has heard his voice, welcomed listening to him interview people, and has been made the better for his erudition and skill. Jennifer Rubin is one of my favorite columnists, to lay that card on the table. She writes for the Washington Post, of course, and what makes it so interesting to me is she is a recovering lawyer. She's a recovering Republican. She may be a Republican, recovering conservative. We'll have to see about that. But she speaks the truth in a clear way, which I particularly appreciate given what I do for the rest of my life when I'm not trying to sell books like Jennifer Rubin's Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. I like this book very much because it is well written. There is an element of getting over the PTSD associated with that night in November and the 4 years that we are trying to forget. But it is a hopeful, positive, encouraging story about the power of women, the power of citizens being engaged in politics and democracy and changing our country, we hope over the long term and in the short term for the better. So with that overlong introduction, let me turn it over to Warren and Jennifer and begin just by thanking you for spending time with us this evening. It's really a great, great pleasure to have you as our guest.
Nice to be here.
Nice for me too, and I'm happy to be here in the oldest bookstore in Los Angeles. I was raised in Berkeley, where people think that people in Los Angeles don't read. So it's nice to know that that there is an oldest bookstore and that it's still going. So Bert, congratulations on maintaining it. And Jennifer, this is a really interesting book, and you're a very interesting person. You're not the same person that I knew when we first met, because you were, as Bert indicated, not just a conservative, but a conservative Republican. And I'm interested in, I think his question is one I've wondered, and I think you answer it in the book, but I'll let you answer it directly here. You still a conservative?
You know, I think the term conservative has become so bastardized and so misused. People who now rationalize violence on January 6th and cheer for the most lawless president in our history call themselves conservative. So I don't think that that word has the meaning that it did when I first considered myself a conservative. And the things that originally drew me to the Republican Party, and it was many decades ago, were a strong foreign policy, defense of human rights in the world, more or less free markets, free trade, robust immigration, and of course, a humility about governance, a belief that incrementalism and working with, not at odds with civil society was generally the best way to go. And that sustained me in the party for a while. And then it became quite evident that none of those, frankly, were either stylistically, tonally, or substantively identified with the Republican Party any longer.
Well, your book, Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump, I'll say the title as many times as I can during the
Thank you.
Time that we have together, is really, I wouldn't call it encyclopedic, but it is so full of detail about what was happening during the Trump administration. It's really kind of a history of the Trump administration from a certain point of view. What was your purpose? What did you have in mind?
Well, I really had two goals in mind first, I thought the role of women was not being fully appreciated in real time by the mainstream media. That when I looked at the Women's March, when I looked at some of the new organizing that was going on, when I looked at the class of 2018, there were a lot of women in very prominent roles. And women, like men, have been engaged in politics for time immemorial, or at least since they've had the vote. But this seemed to be something different. This seemed to be a self-organizing effort, a grassroots effort, really driven by women, and in many instances, in most instances, compelled by the shock that they felt when Donald Trump was elected president. And I didn't think that story was really being told. And so I felt compelled to go tell it and to elevate their story. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that, yes, these women were really a force to be reckoned with and made a huge contribution. I think the other thing that I was looking for as the Trump years were thankfully drawing to a close was to document something about democracy that people often ask me, as I'm sure they ask you, what can be done? The news is so terrible. Trump is awful. This party is so awful. And this is in some respects, a response to that. It's a story about self-actualization. It's a story about alliance building. It's a story about women taking on the role of candidate, of donor, of activist, of protester. And it really, I think, serves as a model going forward for all of us, that if you fear for your country's future, if you fear for democracy, you got to get up off the couch, tear yourself away from doom scrolling on Twitter, and start working for the causes and the candidates that you believe in. And I was certainly inspired by them. And as I go back now and revisit their stories, I'm still inspired by them.
Did you find that it was the women involvement and antipathy toward Trump, which became organized as it did, was it centralized or was it sort of organic?
It was very organic, and that really surprised me. I think most people first got a glimpse of this at the Women's March the day after the inauguration. And people, including myself, kind of assumed, well, there must be these giant organizations that are, sending out busloads of people. And as I started talking with this women, it really was tremendously organized from the ground up. There was a woman from Michigan who began commiserating in her church with some of her friends. And by the time of the Women's March, she had organized about 100 women to go by bus to Washington, D.C. And she was asked, why are you going? And she says, I'm not sure, but I'm going to figure out when I get there. And she wound up organizing a couple thousand women in the area, running for office a couple times. And she was really indicative of these kind of self-made activists. I do tell the story of the married couple that founded Indivisible. And basically they kind of sent out a Google Doc out into the universe because lots of people were saying, oh gosh, what can I do? What can I do? And the response was simply overwhelming. And as time wore on, they realized that, gosh, about 3/4 of the people who are involved in this are women. And so I think wherever I looked, the same phenomenon certainly mobilized them, but this was not a top-down movement. And in fact, many of the people who I spoke to did not have complimentary things to say about the Democratic Party in their area. A woman from Alabama, for example, who became involved in Doug Jones' campaign and later in protesting the Muslim ban, said to me, the Democratic Party was really pathetic in my area. We never listened to them. Their messaging was stale. They didn't seem to be doing anything. So we just felt like we had to do it ourselves. And that story was really just repeated over and over again. And as I said, that's very encouraging because I think that's ultimately whether we're going to sink or swim as a democracy.
Did what I guess you could refer to as a movement of women begin when Hillary Clinton lost and because she lost, or did it develop over time after that?
Well, certainly her loss, but in a greater sense, Trump's victory is what set this off. I think had she lost to a Mitt Romney, she had lost to a John McCain, I'm not sure the same sense of shock and anger and dismay would have been visited. But the fact that she lost to this openly misogynistic, know-nothing character, this bully, this person who obviously did not hold dear American values, was just galling to many women. I analogize it to the A student. They had done everything right in their lives, and she had done everything right. She knew the issues, she studied, she had policy papers, and she still lost to this ignoramus. And so I think it was not just the fact that a woman had run for president and lost, but the sort of character that had beaten her and that continued throughout the presidency. Really, as much as he was a racist, he was also a misogynist. Remember, he had a long line of women who had accused him of sexual assault or sexual harassment. He was openly disparaging of women. He insulted their appearance, their intelligence. And this was a great shock, a great concern to women who had kind of assumed that they'd attained a place in American society where they were respected, where people didn't treat women this way, where they could succeed on their own merits, and where rights and privileges that they had won over the years suddenly now seem very insecure, and that worried them. And many of them were mothers of school-age kids, and they often said to me, I had to be able to answer the question of my child, what did you do during this time? And that was a major motivation for them. So I think it was the Donald Trump phenomenon specifically that got them going. And certainly the defeat of Hillary Clinton was difficult for them to bear. But I think in a way, the Hillary experience made it even more difficult for the crop of women candidates in 2020. And what I mean by that is, at the beginning of that election cycle, when I would go out and talk to all kinds of Democrats, voters, activists, people on campaigns, women and men, they almost uniformly said the same thing. We have to find someone safe. The country cannot take 4 more years of Donald Trump. And what they meant by safe was really a white male. And I found this deeply disturbing. Why do they keep insisting on that? After all, Republican white men had lost many elections, and the Republican Party never said enough with white men. We're going to have to run somebody new. But I think this image of what the president is and what he looks like and what leadership sounds like to the American people is something that's very deep in our psyche. I don't know if the people viewing this have kids or never had one of those posters of all the presidents, and they have them, all in order. And then way down at the bottom in one little corner is Barack Obama, who's the first non-white person. Everybody else is a white male. And that kind of sense that when you say president, people automatically think of a white male had great resonance. And they really began to think, gosh, maybe it was that she was a woman that she lost. Maybe it wasn't James Comey interfering with the election, or maybe it wasn't her failure to go to Wisconsin. And so I think the women who ran in 2020 had an extra burden on them. They had to make the case that no, they're not too risky. In fact, they could be the engine that would turn out the base, that would uplift women, and that could make connections across the party. As it turned out, none of them was successful. And each of them, I think in their own way, had to combat this view of what presidential leadership looks like. Elizabeth Warren, in particular, had a very tough time. She was constantly quizzed and scrutinized for whether she was likable. Likable was a buzzword used with Hillary Clinton as well, that women had to be not so aggressive, not so shrill, not so ambitious, using a phrase that was used about Kamala Harris. And how do you beat that? How do you both be likable and electable? How do you be strong and yet not freak out some of the electorate? And it was a very difficult balancing act for many of these women. You know, men have a whole series of tropes that they use during elections. They go duck hunting. They go to the bar and have a beer. In fact, we even have the "who do you want to have a beer with" question that is asked of voters. Women don't really have that repertoire of things that they do. So they constantly have to invent things. They have to find their own way. And they have to, I think, in some sense, train the public to accept a new vision of female leadership. And I think that's in part why that inauguration day, seeing Kamala Harris up there was so striking to me, because I realized that children of either gender now who are growing up will not think that that's peculiar or odd. They will think of not only the older white male in the dark suit, but also this very charming and very outgoing, very brilliant African-American and Indian-American woman in this bright purple coat standing at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And so I think the election, even though a woman didn't win for president, it was incredibly important in making progress about the way we think about women and about the way we think about presidential politics. So in that respect, I think it also made me hopeful for the future. We didn't get there this time. We got a vice president, but I would be very surprised in the future if either party ever had a field that was all male in the future.
I think it's interesting that you should say that what you just did. It seems to me a lot of the women who ran for president, including a couple of that you mentioned, not the current vice president, Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar and others, were actually better candidates than Joe Biden in the way that we have judged kind of candidates in the past. The only difference was, or the only problem for them was, I think you're saying, is that they were women.
Exactly. And you think about the people who I think you are right in that they kind of looked around at the stage, and I'm sure they thought to themselves, I'm running against this guy, a very bright young mayor, but from a really small city in Indiana, a couple billionaires, one who had never held office, another who had never run for office outside of New York, a bunch of congressmen that most of Americans hadn't heard of. When I interviewed Stacey Abrams, she had a great take on this. She said, you know, men roll out of bed, have a good hair day, and decide, I'm going to run for president. Women, on the other hand, agonize. I'm not prepared enough. I'm not ready. I haven't studied these issues. What about this? What about that? And you really saw this play out on the stage where, you know, Elizabeth Warren had like a bushel load of policy papers. And at times you could see that flashpoint between Amy Klobuchar and Buttigieg over who was qualified and who had the experience to run. So I think there is a built-in assumption that a man doesn't need an excuse to run for office. He just has brilliant ideas. He's going to show up and tell us what he thinks. And a woman has to, in some sense, justify why she's doing what she did. So I think all of these things made it more difficult for women this time around, but I think it will become easier the next time and the time after that.
A number of incidents obviously occurred. It was a long period of time, 4 years, that Donald Trump was president. And you sort of took them off in terms of their ability to get women more excited, more interested in the campaign, more involved in politics. Tell us what some of those were. Obviously, one of them was the replacement of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but there were others as well.
Yes, I think the one that was clearly so important to these women's political maturation was the child separation policy. Again and again, women were reported that they were simply horrified. You couldn't get any worse than this. And I think it was one of those issues that cuts across ideology, cuts across policy. This was not an issue in which women were debating what the right immigration policy was. This was a matter of basic decency, of basic values. And to my surprise, when I went back and I looked at the polling, by about a 10% margin, women cared more about this issue than men. You think, oh gosh, aren't these guys dads or sons or brothers? But in fact, the specter of this violent, emotionally wrenching separation did register more heavily with women. And I think that was one of the things that fueled their anger throughout this period. I think another issue was the gun issue. If you remember, the shooting in Florida was happened the same year as the midterm election. And again, women tend to be more heavily in favor already on the gun issue, in favor of gun safety. And that incident, of course, set off enormous gatherings, marches in Washington and around the country, March for Our Lives, in which women again had the experience of going out, having their voices heard. And every time someone goes to an organizing event, every time someone marches, every time someone signs a petition, it makes it that much more likely they're going to participate in an election, they're going to vote, or they're going to do something even more. And so again and again, they were provoked, I think, to head for the streets or to call up their friends or to give money. And those were some of the incidents that kind of pushed things along. There were also, I think, things like the December 2017 race in Alabama, where you had Roy Moore, who is this very extreme judge who well into the campaign, it turns out he has a long list of women who made very detailed allegations that he had physically, sexually assaulted them, molested them when they were teens, young teens in some cases. And it was that sense that, oh my gosh, how did these guys get into power? How come there's never a price to be paid for these people? And that served as a motivation. And in fact, particularly African-American women organized like gangbusters in that race and pulled off a huge upset in December of 2017. So I think there were lots of inflection points, lots of motivators. And I do think also success breeds success. I think when the ACA was not repealed, that was a huge morale boost for the resistance in general and for women in particular. They suddenly realized we can affect change. We don't have the House, we don't have the Senate, we don't have the White House, and somehow we won this fight. And we won it through organization and through advocacy. And likewise, when they took the House in 2018, this was vindication. Okay, maybe America hasn't entirely lost its mind. Maybe there's an opportunity to re-engage with voters and talk about a different kind of politics. So you're right, there were many, many steps along the way. And I think at any time, had Donald Trump gotten off Twitter, gotten off social media, started acting like a normal person, some of the impetus for this movement would have if not disappeared, at least lessened. But he was a constant thorn in their side. He was a constant source of aggravation and horror. And women turned that into a positive energy to engage in politics.
You use the term resistance to title your book. What is being resisted against? Is it sexism in general? In which case there's still plenty of it, and we see it every day, obviously. Or is it something more specific?
I think it's two things. One, I think it is a style of politics that is defined by cruelty. A very good columnist writes sometimes for the Washington Post and also for Atlantic, coined the phrase that cruelty is the point, that the elevation of anger, of bitterness, of meanness, of division is something that many women recoiled from. And they saw Trump as turning American politics into something out of Eastern Europe in the 21st century or Germany in the 1930s, a authoritarian, bullying, mean kind of politics. And it went beyond, I think, any policy prescription, and women were often the target of this. As we talked about earlier, he was very antagonistic towards women. And I think the other thing, the other resistance really does go to this issue of democracy, that there really was a concern that he was systematically eroding the protections, the institutions, the norms we have that keep democracy in place, the independence of the Department of Justice, the notion that the president shouldn't use the White House as a stage for his political events, his really contempt for reality, his ability to disparage the press as the enemy of the people and to create a completely parallel universe is classic authoritarian propaganda. So I think wherever they looked, they saw these danger signs, and I think it very much concerned them, I think properly so. And many of the women who had these national security backgrounds cited this as the issue. They really felt democracy, the Constitution was at risk. Everybody in the military, everybody who works for the government does take an oath. And they said to a person, they said, we went back, we thought about the oath. I couldn't do nothing. I couldn't simply let him run away with our democracy. And unfortunately, as we saw after the election, things got even worse as the party embraced the big lie, as he fanned the flames of violence. And in that respect, the resistance has to go on, because democracy is very much at risk to this day. And at the time I wrote this, at the time I finished the book, I was somewhat elated. Great, we got rid of Donald Trump. Okay, phew, things can go back to normal. And of course, they haven't. And in some respects, the Republican Party has gotten more radical, more authoritarian, more divorced from reality. And so you have to go back to the resistance, women, but also men, and say, sorry, you got to stay engaged. It's not enough. You got to keep going. And that's the big challenge, I think, going forward for many of these women.
There still are a lot of women in the Republican Party. There are a lot of Republican leaders who are women, even though the party has now become the province, if you will, of Donald Trump. And it seems it's going to stay that way for a long time to come. How do you explain that? How is it that they were able to ignore the kinds of things that the women that you've written about were so concerned about? And why weren't they concerned too?
Well, women are complicated people, and there are many cross currents that affect voters. There is geography, whether you're from the South, whether you're from the North. There's religion. Are you among those people who don't identify with any religion and then tend to be among the most progressive people? Or are you people who identify with an evangelical white church, which casts them in a very conservative role? Are they college educated or not? And so to some extent, women are not immune from many of the same factors that shape male political views. There are women viewers who sit there and watch Fox News all day long, and they come away with the same worldview that their male counterparts do. So it is not a matter that all women saw the light and 100% of them voted for Joe Biden. It was, as it always is in politics, a matter of degree. How active are they? How many women are running for office? And when you looked at certain categories of women, there was clear that there was movement. White college-educated women now are voting overwhelmingly Democratic. And you can imagine that these were many of the people who were so horrified by Donald Trump and who took to the streets. Latino women, although Trump made inroads with Latino males, Latinas voted in very high numbers for Joe Biden. Suburban women, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and Native American women, all of these groups organized. So you are absolutely right that it is not a one size fits all, but it is, I think, simultaneously true that women have risen in their political activism, that we had the highest gender gap in history for president. That's the difference between male support and female support. And until the Republican Party, I think, changes its ways, I don't see that shifting anytime soon. I think the tone, the level of animosity towards immigrants, towards the poor, towards African Americans is a huge turnoff for women. And they are going to continue to vote Democratic, I think, until they see a party that is more humane, that is more to their liking, that reflects their own values.
Let's talk about some of the more familiar names. We've mentioned a bunch of them, although you indicated at the outset that this was a organic, widespread, grassroots kind of action. But I am interested in your take on certain people, and some of them you've interviewed. Liz Cheney is one of them. What about Liz Cheney? What do you have to say about her?
Well, she is a very interesting character. If you had asked me, I don't know, a year ago, who would be a Republican in the House, who would be the one to stand up for truth, who would be the one to go against her party, who would be the one to really take on her party for embracing the big lie, I would not have picked Liz Cheney. She is a very strong conservative, well to my right, and yet there was something about Trump and about her experience in public service that really clashed, that she really saw the light. And you have to admire someone who actually agrees with Trump on all these issues, who nevertheless realizes that it's time to defend democracy. Now, I think she is going to invariably come to a point of conflict. If she is running as a Republican and she is helping other Republicans run for office, she is helping, in essence, to make Kevin McCarthy the next speaker. And she has said many, many times he's unfit. It was unseemly. It's rotten show of judgment to try to cultivate Donald Trump. So on one hand, she wants to remain inside the Republican Party. On the other hand, the Republican Party at this point is so suffused with Trump and Trumpism that it makes it very hard. What is she going to do when it comes to voting access and voting suppression? I was very pleased when she spoke out about the phony audit that was going on in Arizona. But at the same time, she has not broken with her party on issues of voter access. So we all have these contradictions, and I think she is going to have some big ones coming up. And I don't know whether she is going to be able to remain in the party. She may not win her race for re-election from Wyoming, and it'll be interesting to see if she doesn't. Does she run as an independent? Does she run for president? And I think, unfortunately, when these things happen, there get to be fewer and fewer stabilizing voices on the Republican Party. One by one, they decide not to run or they lose their primaries. So even if the party shrinks somewhat, it gets worse. It gets more doctrinaire, it gets more extreme, more infused with this toxic nostalgia. So I remain very interested to see really how it all turns out for her.
To what extent do you think that the movement of women in the directions that you suggest is threatening to a lot of men? And is there likely to be a backlash as a result?
There is always a backlash. And I think we saw it, and I write about it in the book, at the very beginning of the presidential election cycle, 2019. Kavanaugh goes on the bench, and the first wave of these abortion bans go on the books. We're seeing it again with this Texas law, which incentivizes people to spy on women and turn them in if they're seeking an abortion. Really, just a grotesque violation of privacy and of their personal autonomy. So I think there is always a backlash. And as I indicate, much of the Trump movement is very toxically male, is very antagonistic towards women, very insulting. And you have heard the slurs against Nancy Pelosi, for example, and whether it was the real violence on January 6th, where they were really out to find her and do her harm, or whether it was Kevin McCarthy joking that he was going to pummel him her with his gavel. There is this animosity, there is this pushback. Now, I think the longer women are in office, the more they establish their own relationship with their constituents, the harder it will be to oust them. So the worst election for any representative is someone who wins a open seat or flips a seat, and then the next election is always the hardest because the other side is poised to knock them out. So if they've survived their sophomore race, then I think the benefits of incumbency take hold, and they can be seen as a regular politician who's delivering. But I will add that although women have made inroads, only about 25% of the House is women. That's phenomenally underrepresented. It's not like that in other Western countries. We have really a handful of women governors. So when it comes to executive power or even full representation in national politics, we got a long, long way to go. And hopefully once you get a critical mass, it makes it easier for others to follow. But we are nowhere where many Western democracies are.
What about local government races and legislative races? Are there more women in those? Seems to me there are.
They tend to be. And in fact, the year of the woman in 1992, many of those women came from local government. They were mayors, they were city council women. It was a great breeding ground, a growing experience for women to elevate themselves. What was unusual in 2018 is rather than those types of women, you got people who had never run for any office at all. You had these women with national security background. You had women who were in business. You had all sorts of kind of have backgrounds. And, you know, it's funny. In one way, Donald Trump sort of opened it up for people who don't have a political resume, because if he can run for office, anyone can run for office, right? But I think women nevertheless looked at this guy and they said, you know, he's a joke. I just heard my congressman talking. He's a joke. I can do this too. So I think the need to be over-credentialed to run for office is perhaps something that is slowly being put behind us so that women will feel more compelled to run, more at ease, simply putting themselves out there at whatever level.
I think it's time to let some people ask other people other than I to ask some questions. Am I right?
Yeah, it would be great. So just so everybody who's attending knows, we do have the Q&A option. You could put it there, or you can also put your questions in the chat too, whatever is easiest for you. And then Bert, the question?
Yes, I have one observation that I offer from my two 30-something daughters, one a lawyer and one in business, which is their joint wish is to have the confidence of a mediocre white man. So I think that may go to your point. My question and concern, though, is I may be the only person in America who believes that Donald Trump will not be running as a Republican candidate for president, either because he will not be at liberty, as we former prosecutors used to say.
Takes a long time. Takes a long time to put him in.
We'll see. Time will tell. Or for some other health or maybe he'll come to his senses reason. And what I wonder about is whether the polarizing value of him as a candidate will lead to a change in whether women will want to come out to beat Chris Christie or Ben Sasse or Josh Hawley or anybody else in that clown car. How important was it, do you think, to the women who showed up and really devoted themselves to change, that it was Donald Trump rather than a more potentially palatable male Republican?
I think it was very important at the time. And you ask a great question, which is, where does Trumpism go without Trump? And I think the answer is that there are going to be a lot of mini-me little Trumps out there. And we already see it. We already see Ron DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida, picking up the rhetoric, picking up the vaccine mandate, denial. We see Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, backing the ludicrous abortion bounty bill and seeking to restrict voting rights. So you're going to see a lot of these characters modeling themselves on Donald Trump. And I think the question goes both ways. First of all, are they going to be able to turn out their own base? Is there really the same enthusiasm in MAGA land for Ted Cruz as there was for Donald Trump? A lot of what drove the appeal of Donald Trump was that he was completely outside the political realm, that he really didn't know anything and didn't talk like a politician. He wasn't a swamp creature of Washington. And it's not clear to me that any of these characters are going to be able to fully inherit that mantle of Trump. By the same token, you're exactly right. If the Republicans start running palatable people, normal people who seek to return to some kind of cohesive, ideology, it will become much more difficult, I think, for Democrats to win. Right now, they can not only tout their own policies, but they can point to the Republicans and say, these guys are nuts. And in fact, what you saw in California was that Gavin Newsom exactly did that in the recall. He was able to equate Larry Elder with Trump and with DeSantis and with Abbott and present to people, I think, an accurate, but also a radical portrait of the Republican Party. And I think Democrats will endeavor to do that so long as they keep following in Donald Trump's footsteps. We have a governor's race in Virginia, which exactly the same phenomenon is playing out. Terry McAuliffe used to be governor, is running again for governor, very mainstream pro-business Democrat, is running against a guy who has tried to maneuver himself to appear like sort of a Mitt Romney kind of Republican. And in fact, he is a Donald Trump acolyte. He was endorsed enthusiastically. He's running on election integrity. And sure enough, McAuliffe is saying, this guy is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Don't buy it. We don't want to turn Virginia into Texas or into Florida. So I think if Donald Trump doesn't run, I think perhaps there will be less excitement on their side and less fury on the other side. But by the same token, I don't see the Republican Party abandoning this kind of parallel universe, self-delusional, very right-wing nationalist kind of framework. And they're going to have to, I think, either survive on that, or they're going to get drubbed and have to regroup and rethink their ideology.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We have another question that was kind of related to something you mentioned just now. So like this idea of the integrity of voting. So Lori wants to know if you have any guidance on for future elections, like for the accuracy of those elections. What would you suggest for young women specifically when it comes to getting their vote counted?
Well, you want to obviously, if your state has it, be able to track your vote. Most states now, whether you vote early or whether you vote absentee or whether you vote in person, can track whether your vote has actually been counted, and everyone should do that. People should also volunteer to be election day workers. This is a big problem. It's a big problem in the wake of 2020, when a lot of people said, I'm not putting up with this abuse. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm out of here. It also tends to be a volunteer opportunity for older people, many of whom didn't and still don't want to go out in crowds because of COVID. And so a really terrific way to contribute is to volunteer as an election worker. If you're a lawyer, volunteer to be on the helpline for voters who encounter problems while they're voting. Become involved in groups, whether it's the ACLU, whether it's one of the other legal groups that is fighting against voter suppression and voter subversion. And of course, make your voices heard. Politicians do at some level respond to some political pressure. And if I think there is a successful battle to be waged against these voter suppression, it is to make clear that politicians who seek to limit the people who are going to vote and want to count the votes themselves are really trying to steal your vote. And I think that is a bipartisan message that has to get out, that this is not some arcane issue of whether you have 5 days of early voting or 2. It's not some arcane issue of who counts the votes. This is about politicians trying to, excuse the expression, rig the system so that only their people vote and then they get to count the votes. And that can't be the system that we live in.
Can I ask a personal question that may follow from your book? What would it take for you to resume your affiliation with the Republican Party?
It would take a miracle on the biblical scale. People have asked that question of me a lot, as you can imagine. Say, would you ever vote Republican? My answer is no. You stage one violent insurrection, and you really have lost my vote permanently. Now, you know, I guess decades from now, God willing, if I'm still alive, all of these people, you know, have spent their 40 years in the desert, have died out. You have a new crop of candidates, an entirely different, you know, profile, sure, perhaps. But I cannot never go back to supporting this crop of Republicans, this Republican Party. I think they have disqualified themselves for life from public service by their actions and by their words.
Do you think that there will be, if Trump runs again, that there will be a mobilization of women even greater than we have seen that you have described in your book? Will there be something almost revolutionary about it?
I think so, in part because they not only know what it was like to have Trump as president, but they saw January 6th, which followed the last election. And I think there is a legitimate concern. I don't think people are being hysterical when they are very worried whether we will have a continual cycle of election subversion, of crying foul, of pre-predicting that the vote is rigged, there's fraud going on, and then violence resulting. That is something we've never contemplated in this country. And you can kind of hear the hoofbeats once again as one candidate after another says, oh, there's something fishy going on here. Larry Elder tried it for a while. Glenn Youngkin is now demanding that there be audits of the election machinery, which was already audited, actually. And you hear some of the fringier elements in the House really either obliquely or sometimes directly encouraging violence, that, you know, you keep this up, you Democrats, and we'll have no choice but to resort to violence. This is very scary stuff. And I actually think that the January 6th Commission and whatever investigation is done by the Justice Department will be stunning. I think we know a fraction of what went on between Election Day and January 6th. Some of it is beginning to come out in revelatory books, in some of the documents. I think we have a lot more to learn. And my hope would be that we're not so far past the point of being horrified and appalled that it makes some import on people and reminds them that we can't ever be in a position again where one party is threatening violence or carrying out violence because they don't like the result of an election.
I have a question that's actually kind of close to me as a person from Kentucky. You mentioned that when we were doing the recall election, that Larry Elder's association with Trump really kind of like did him in, like it made him a reckoning. And I was kind of wondering what you thought about a reckoning possibly coming for Mitch McConnell because of his ties to Trump. Like, do you think that might happen this time?
Well, it didn't, unfortunately, in 2020. I talk about that race a bit in the book. I follow Amy McGrath, who is one of these people, who had a national security background, was a Marine pilot, deployed multiple times, flew bombing missions in Iraq, and she wasn't successful. She had a very difficult problem because in Kentucky, Trump is super popular. So she couldn't very well say, well, Mitch McConnell is in Donald Trump's pocket. The electorate would have, applauded. That's right. That's what we want. So it becomes a very difficult task to figure out how to kind of separate some of these people in a red state where the former president may still be somewhat popular. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens in Iowa this time around. Chuck Grassley, who is now 87, 88 years old, announced he's going to be running for re-election. And so will his Democratic opponent attack that he's been too reticent, too docile in the face of the Trump elements? Or will they make some other argument, like the one Amy McGrath tried unsuccessfully, which is, you've just been in Washington too long. It's time for new, fresh faces, new blood. So that becomes a difficult issue. At the same time, on the flip side, we see a new development that I think may bear some fruit. In Utah, Mike Lee, who is among the most conservative Republicans, will be running for re-election. The Democratic Party has about 15% support in that state. So Evan McMullin, who ran actually as an independent conservative for president in 2016, wound up with more than 20% of the vote in Utah, has declared he's going to run as an independent conservative. And he is running on not a pro-Joe Biden platform. He is running on these democracy issues. And he takes issue with some of the things that Biden has proposed, in particular, the pullout from Iraq. Evan was a CIA operative. So it'll be interesting to see what techniques, what tactics Democrats and ex-Republicans use. Sometimes it's going to be a primary challenge. Sometimes it's going to be an independent. And sometimes it's going to be a policy switch. In Texas, you now have Matthew Dowd, who started his political career, not started, but made his political career quite prominent as an advisor to George W. Bush. He is now running for lieutenant governor as a Democrat. And his pitch is, I'm no, left-wing socialist. I'm the same person I always was, but these people are acting in ways that are antithetical to our deepest held values. So it's going to be really interesting to see which of these techniques, if any, are able to make some inroads in red states. One of the things we saw in 2020 was a reminder that the electorate is never static. Joe Biden broke through in Georgia and Arizona, two fairly red states up until that time. The percentage of white voters went down to 60% in 2020, still a majority, but much less than it had been. So when you think ahead to future elections, you also have to think what electorate is going to be there, what electorate is going to show up as we move towards a younger generation that is more diverse, that is in many ways more progressive, less religiously identified. That will pose its own problems for Republicans. So I think we not only have to keep an eye on the candidates, we have to keep an eye on the electorate, which is in constant flux.
Mm-hmm. I feel like this next question is kind of just like a continuation of what you're already saying, but we do have a question of what do we think about the 2022 midterms? The person says, I can't imagine losing the House and the Senate.
Well, it is possible. There is a historical pattern that the first midterm election, often the party that lost the White House comes roaring back and they take seats. But I think we are in sui generis times. We are in absolutely unique times, and the past is not a great predictor of the future. I think as horrible as it may sound, the Republicans could very well take the House. And I think there are two things that would help the Democrats. One is they have to deliver on their agenda. The constant talk about these two very large pieces of legislation churning along is important, because I think if they come up with nothing, they will be a huge disappointment to their base. And I think part of what has to get done is some type of election reform. And the other thing they have to do is to be able to make a sharply worded, focused attack that Republicans are behaving in ways that are not American. I know Democrats like to make all kinds of policy arguments. They don't like to get down in the dirt. They don't like to seem too mean. But listen, you know, they are fighting with people who really have no principles, who use sort of the natural inclination to treat both parties kind of the same, this kind of moral equivalence, to kind of conceal their true agenda. And I think Democrats have to become better at calling them out and identifying them as extreme, as radical, as threatening to American democracy. It's no time to, you know, play patty cake. And I think if Democrats do those two things, and if Republicans keep acting like Trump acolytes, there is a possibility, certainly, that the Democrats will prevent the House from tipping over. The Senate is a little different story. There are a few pickup opportunities for Democrats. The senator from Republican senator from Pennsylvania is retiring. We don't know yet whether the Republican senator from Wisconsin, which is another swing state, will run again. So there are some opportunities for them in other places. But it is, although horrible to contemplate, it is certainly possible that the House flips back.
Let me interject to say that I'm so grateful for the two of you being here tonight. This was really fun and interesting, and this call for women to resist that you articulate here, and you include the heroines of your book in Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. I guess we can leave with the hope and perhaps the expectation that once again we can rely upon the women to save the country from ourselves. Thank you both for being here. This was really special. And let me again urge everybody to buy this book. It's really worth reading. It will remind you of things that you have put out of your memory, but it has a happy ending as demonstrated by Jennifer being here today. So thank you all for being here. This was a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Warren.
Thank you for your brilliance. Thank you, Warren, for the thought-provoking questions, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today for Chevalier. Awesome. Have a great night, guys.
Bye-bye.